Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest stories.
It was supposed to be just another office party. Laughter, drinks, the usual polite chatter. But from the moment Grace Harwood stepped into the softly lit venue, she felt like she didn't belong. The room buzzed with familiar faces, familiar to David, not to her. He moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging inside jokes and shoulder pats, while she clung to her wine glass like an anchor. The jazz playing overhead seemed to blur into a distant hum as Grace scanned the room, her nerves humming beneath her calm exterior. She had come to support her husband, to smile and nod through conversations with people who barely knew her name. But something about this night felt different. Not louder or flashier, just charged. Every cheer sounded slightly too rehearsed, every laugh a little too loud. It wasn't fear exactly that stirred in her chest, but a subtle, unshakable sense of dissonance. As David laughed across the room, Grace realized it wasn't the music or the strangers that bothered her. It was the distance, the emotional one growing silently between them. And as she stood in the corner, half in shadow, she couldn't help but feel that something was coming. She just didn't know what. She noticed her the moment they arrived, Isabel. Grace didn't know her name yet, but something about the woman's presence pierced through the hum of conversation like a spotlight in a quiet theater. She stood tall, poised, with raven black hair cascading over her shoulders, and an effortless confidence that turned heads without trying. Grace watched as David's eyes lit up the moment he saw her. The way his posture subtly shifted, more alert, more engaged. Isabel moved with the kind of grace that didn't seem learned, only inherited, and when she laughed, just a touch too long, a note too melodic, Grace felt something flicker inside her. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was a knowing, a whisper of warning. The woman didn't just enter the room, she claimed it. Grace noticed how Isabel hovered near David during group conversations, how her hand casually brushed his arm as if she had every right to be that close. And when their eyes met across the room, Isabel offered a smile, warm, polished, but oddly unreadable. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't friendly. It was something in between. A challenge wrapped in courtesy. Grace's stomach tightened. In that moment, she knew Isabel wasn't just another colleague. There was something about her that made Grace feel displaced. Like she'd walked into a scene where she wasn't meant to be the leading lady anymore. And as Isabel leaned in to whisper something to David, her fingers barely grazing his coat sleeve, Grace realized this night was far from ordinary. It was the start of something. Grace wasn't the kind of woman to jump to conclusions. But there's a language spoken in glances and gestures that only someone deeply attuned to their partner can understand. All night, she watched the subtle choreography unfolding between David and Isabel. Tiny exchanges that seemed innocent enough on the surface, but carried a different weight beneath. Isabel leaned in just a bit too close when she spoke to him, her laugh lingering in the air like perfume. Her hand would rest on David's arm for a second longer than necessary, her eyes trailing him even when he moved to speak with others. David, for his part, seemed oblivious. Or perhaps he wasn't. Grace caught the way he smiled at Isabel, familiar, relaxed. Warm in a way he hadn't been with Grace in weeks. There was nothing overtly wrong, nothing loud or scandalous. It was all in the margins. The unspoken. Grace's chest grew heavier with each interaction, like she was being slowly pushed to the edges of her own relationship. She stood beside David, nodded through conversations, laughed when expected, but inside her instincts were flaring. This wasn't imagination. This was a woman circling a man with precision. And though Grace couldn't prove anything, she didn't need to. A woman knows when another woman is crossing a line. It wasn't just about what Isabel was doing, it was the way David responded. The way he didn't seem to notice. Or worse, the way he did. And that's when Grace knew. Something unspoken had already begun. Grace had retreated to a quiet corner of the venue, the low hum of music and clinking glasses fading into background noise, as she nursed a half-empty glass of wine. She needed space, to breathe, to think, to quiet the storm that had been steadily building inside her since they arrived. That's when Isabel appeared, as if summoned by Grace's unease. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor, her silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the candlelit backdrop. "Grace, right?" she said, her voice smooth as silk, her smile perfectly measured. Grace nodded, wary. Enjoying the evening? Isabel asked, eyes flicking briefly across the room toward David. Grace forced a polite smile. It's nice. A bit loud maybe. Isabel laughed, not loudly but intentionally, like she wanted to be overheard. David mentioned you weren't much for these things. You're very poised, though. Graceful. There was an edge beneath the compliment, a flicker of something else in her tone, admiration maybe, or warning. Then she added more softly, he's lucky, you know, but even the best relationships can get predictable. Grace blinked, the words hanging between them like fog. Was it an innocent observation? A dig cloaked in flattery? Before Grace could respond, Isabel's phone rang. Excuse me, she said, and vanished into the crowd. Grace stood frozen, the wine suddenly bitter in her mouth. The way Isabel had spoken, the way her words had coiled with intent, it wasn't just a social pleasantry. It was a message, and Grace had heard it loud and clear. The car ride home was filled with the kind of silence that hummed louder than any words. Grace stared out the window, city lights smearing across the glass like blurred memories. David drove with one hand on the wheel, the other drumming absently against his thigh. He seemed content, even energized from the evening. That wasn't so bad, right? He asked, flashing her that familiar, easy smile, the one that used to settle her heart. Grace returned it, though it felt more like muscle memory than sincerity. It was fine, she replied softly. Then he said it. Isabel was really fun tonight. She's got such a good vibe. The word struck her like a cold splash of water. Grace didn't flinch, but inside, her chest tightened. Fun. Good vibe. She wondered if he noticed the way Isabel lingered near him, the way she casually touched his arm, spoke to him as if no one else existed. She said you were classy, he added, almost offhandedly. Thought that was sweet. Grace let out a small laugh, sharp and hollow. Yeah, she murmured. Sweet. Her hands twisted in her lap. David didn't notice. He just kept driving, eyes on the road, utterly unaware of the storm he'd just stirred. Grace stared ahead, heart pounding against her ribs. The night was over, but something had shifted, something unspoken. And as David drove on, chatting about office gossip, Grace sat beside him in growing silence, wondering how many more moments like this she would have to quietly swallow. A few days later, as sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, and the rhythm of routine returned to their home, Grace found herself alone with David's phone. It had buzzed once, just once, while he was in the shower, the screen lighting up with a preview that made her breath catch. Hey David. I really enjoyed our chat the other night. Maybe we could catch up again soon. Just the two of us. Isabel. The words danced innocently across the screen, but Grace felt their weight settle like a stone in her stomach. Just the two of us. Not a team lunch. Not an office update. Just them. Her heart pounded as she stared at the message, caught between disbelief and the kind of sickening clarity that no one wants to confront. Her hands trembled, not with rage, but with the ache of validation. This wasn't just a feeling anymore. There it was in text. Polite, measured, yet unmistakably personal. She could hear Isabel's voice in her head, that soft purr at the party, the way she'd tilted her head, said sometimes, we all need a little excitement. Grace had wanted to believe she was being paranoid, reading too much into glances and gestures, but now she wasn't so sure. Her instincts had been right. This wasn't just friendliness. It was a line being tested, crossed. Grace placed the phone down as she heard the water stop upstairs. The message sat there in the silence, like a secret already unraveling, one she could no longer ignore. For the next few days, Grace moved through her home like a shadow of herself, present but unreachable. She folded laundry with mechanical care, prepared meals with the same practiced rhythm, answered David's questions with smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. On the outside, everything looked normal, but inside she was unraveling in quiet, invisible ways. The message from Isabel had embedded itself in her thoughts like a splinter. It didn't scream, it whispered. And in that whisper, Grace heard everything she'd been afraid to admit. The distance between her and David wasn't imagined. It was growing inch by inch. Every time he laughed at a text she didn't see, or brushed off her questions with practiced ease, doubt became a silent houseguest, sitting beside her at dinner, curling up with her in bed. Each time David reached for his phone, Grace felt her chest tighten. Was it Isabel again? Was he answering? She hated how easily suspicion came, how quickly it consumed her once solid trust. But trust, she realized, didn't always shatter. It wore thin like fabric stretched too many times. She wanted to confront him, to scream and demand answers. But the fear of being wrong, of being labeled insecure or jealous, kept her silent. Instead, she watched. She waited. She listened to the space between their conversations, to the way his gaze flickered just a second too long when her phone buzzed. Grace wasn't ready to accuse, but she was no longer willing to pretend. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. One evening, while David was out running a quick errand, Grace found herself alone again with his phone, left on the kitchen counter, screen unlocked, almost as if inviting her to peek. Her heart raced with a mix of guilt and urgency as she opened the message thread with Isabel. It was still there, the same message she had seen days before, unchanged. No new replies. No further escalation. Yet the silence somehow made it worse. Grace stared at the screen, her fingers hovering above the keys. She wasn't sure what compelled her. Desperation, protectiveness. Maybe just the need to feel some kind of control. With a steady breath, she typed, "Hey Isabel, thanks for your message. David's been swamped with work lately, but I'll let him know you reached out. Hope you're doing well." She paused, reread it twice, then hit send. It was simple, polite, unassuming, but every word carried weight. It was her way of quietly drawing a boundary, one Isabel would recognize. As the message sent, a wave of adrenaline surged through Grace, followed quickly by a crushing mix of shame and relief. What had she become? Someone checking messages, sending replies on behalf of her husband? But another voice within her whispered, "You're just protecting what's yours." By the time David returned, she was back to chopping vegetables, acting as if nothing had happened. But inside she was alert, watching. The game had changed, and now Grace was no longer just reacting. She was making her move. It was the photo that broke her. Just as Grace was beginning to believe things might settle, that her message to Isabel had drawn a line, David's phone buzzed again innocuously, resting on the kitchen counter like a loaded question. She didn't mean to look, but she did. And there it was, a photo from Isabel. Not provocative, not scandalous, just her at a cafe. Sunlight pouring through the window, her hair tucked loosely behind one ear, a smile playing at her lips. But beneath the image, the message. Had coffee here today and thought of that night at the party. Maybe next time, just us? No crowds. Grace stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The suggestion was subtle, but sharp, a dagger wrapped in silk. There was no pretense of professionalism now, no hiding behind harmless chatter. This was intentional, calculated. The familiarity in the tone, the implication of intimacy, it confirmed what Grace had feared all along. Isabel wasn't just testing the boundary anymore. She was walking straight past it. Grace's fingers trembled as she set the phone down, her pulse drumming in her ears. It wasn't only the message, it was the boldness of it, the confidence in assuming David might welcome it. And worse, the terrifying question now clawing at her. Had he already? As she stood there, the smell of dinner on the stove thickening the air, Grace realized something vital had shifted. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a crossroads, and soon she would have to choose which path to take. When David walked into the kitchen that evening, Grace was still standing by the counter, motionless, her hand resting lightly on the edge as if bracing herself. He looked up, sensing something in the air, and paused. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. Grace turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I saw Isabel's message," she said quietly. The air thickened. David blinked, then exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Grace," he began, but she held up a hand. "Don't. Not yet. Just answer me this. Do you really think this is normal? That her sending you photos and suggesting private meetups is just friendly?" Her voice didn't crack, but the tremble behind it was unmistakable. David looked stunned, caught between denial and discomfort. "She's always been kind of forward," he muttered. "But I didn't think it was a big deal." Grace's eyes narrowed, her voice firm now. It is a big deal when someone keeps inching their way into your life, and your response is to shrug it off. She paused, heart pounding. I'm not accusing you of cheating, David, but I am telling you that this feels like betrayal. Maybe not physical, but emotional? Yes. Silence settled over them, heavy and unrelenting. David finally stepped closer, guilt etched into every line of his face. I didn't see it that way, he admitted. But if it's hurting you, I need to start paying attention. Grace nodded once. The ground between them was cracked, but not yet broken. Not yet. Grace couldn't shake the knot in her chest. Words from David brought some relief, but not resolution. His guilt, though genuine, wasn't enough, not this time. Something inside her whispered that she needed more than reassurances. She needed truth. And the only person who could give her that now was Isabel. So, the next morning, with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, Grace typed the message. Hi, Isabel. I was hoping we could talk. Just the two of us. The reply came almost instantly, agreeable, polite. With a hint of curiosity, they met at a quiet cafe, one Grace had chosen for its stillness. Isabel was already seated by the window, a latte in hand, and that same unreadable smile on her lips. Grace, she said, standing to greet her, voice warm but guarded. I wasn't sure you'd come. Grace sat without returning the pleasantry. I need to understand what's been happening between you and my husband. The words came calmly but carried a charge. Isabel leaned back, eyes flickering. There's nothing happening. If that's what you're asking, she said. But Grace saw the flicker of guilt, small, fleeting but real. Then why the messages? The photo? The hints? Isabel's expression shifted. For a moment, something vulnerable surfaced. Because I liked the attention. Not him, Grace. The feeling of being seen. I never meant to interfere. I let it go too far. Grace stared at her, unsure whether to feel relief or fury. She had come for clarity, and in that confession she found it. Painful, but necessary. When Grace returned home from the cafe, her thoughts were tangled in a storm of emotion, relief, confusion, and the ache of betrayal that had no clear villain. Isabel hadn't denied the boundary had been crossed. She had admitted it openly, even with a strange sort of remorse. But that didn't erase the damage. It didn't stitch the unraveling threads back together. David was waiting for her when she stepped inside, perched at the edge of the couch, his expression taut with uncertainty. How did it go? He asked. Grace sat down beside him, taking a moment to gather herself. We talked, she said softly. She admitted to overstepping, to liking the attention. She said it wasn't about you. It was about feeling seen. David looked away, shame flickering across his face. And me? He asked. Do you believe I crossed a line too? Grace hesitated, her voice gentle but resolute. Maybe not intentionally, but by not noticing, by not setting boundaries, you left the door cracked open. David nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. Then I'll close it, he said. I'll be better. I want to rebuild this with you. Grace studied him. The sincerity was there. But so was the work ahead. Trust doesn't rebound, it rebuilds. Brick by brick, word by word. Then let's start, she whispered. And in that quiet moment they sat side by side. Not with everything fixed, but with something far more powerful than perfection. A willingness to fight for what was almost lost. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over their home. A calm not of closure, but of mutual effort. David became more mindful, more present. He let Grace read his messages without hesitation, mentioned even the most trivial interactions with Isabel, and worked to rebuild the small, everyday acts of intimacy they had let slip away. But for Grace, the unease hadn't vanished, it had only dulled to a quiet echo. She still remembered the way Isabel had looked at David, the subtle flicker of something unsaid in her eyes. She believed the confession, yes. Yet something in her still watched the door, listened for the next buzz of a phone. Healing wasn't linear, she realized. Some days, she felt closer to David than she had in years. Other days, she still questioned whether trust could truly be restored once it had been fractured. But what comforted her was David's consistency. Not perfection but effort. He didn't try to erase what happened. He met her where she stood, even when she didn't know what she needed. Isabel faded slowly from their lives, retreating like a storm that had passed, but left puddles in its wake. Grace knew they weren't in the clear, but they were facing the same direction again. And sometimes that was enough. As they sat together on the back porch one quiet evening, hands lightly touching, Grace looked at him, not with certainty but with choice. And in that quiet choosing, love found a new beginning, not naive, not blind, but brave. In today's world of constant digital connection, emotional boundaries are more important than ever. Relationships don't just break from dramatic betrayals, they erode quietly through small, unchecked moments of attention, secrecy, and emotional distance. If something feels off, trust your intuition and communicate honestly before assumptions take root. Don't let subtle red flags go unspoken. Silence can be more damaging than confrontation. Transparency, mutual respect, and emotional presence are the cornerstones of trust. In a world full of distractions and blurred lines, the most courageous act is choosing to show up, every day, for the one you love with clarity, not confusion.